of Alderman, Court of Alderman, Court of Alderman, Court of Alderman, Court of Alderman. Hello, friends. Happy Saturday. Court of Alderman. Continuing Defoe's Journal of the Plague Year from page 189 to 197. We're in the home stretch. I think we'll be finished by Friday, and I have an idea of what I'm going to follow it up with. It's a big idea. If you follow me on Instagram, you'll know what it is. I might chicken out of it, though, so I'm not committing to it here yet. What we have over the next 8 or so pages are the narrator getting a bit bored of reeling off horror stories and going back to the bills of death. If anyone was worried we weren't going to have any more of those, no, there's one today. And then he says, well, at least there was bread. And he doesn't have a bad thing to say about the Lord Mayor, who I looked up. His name is John Lawrence. They change the Lord Mayor of London every year. I know the following Lord Mayor, Thomas Bloodworth, was mayor during the time of the Great Fire of London, and I know him from the tours because I know that on the first night of the Great Fire of London he said, a woman could piss it out. Well, I don't know what woman he had in mind, but she didn't. That said, the total bills of death for the Great Fire were, I believe, just 6 in total. And the moral of that is it's clearly easier to tell who was caught a Great Fire of London than it is to tell who was caught the plague. I could dwell a great while upon the calamities of this dreadful time, and go on to describe the objects that appeared among us every day, the dreadful extravagancies which the distraction of sick people drove them into, how the streets began now to be fuller of frightful objects, and families to be made even a terror to themselves. But, after I have told you as I have above, that one man being tied in his bed and finding no other way to deliver himself, set the bed on fire with his candle, which unhappily stood within his reach, and burnt himself in his bed, and how another, by the insufferable torment he bore, danced and sung naked in the streets, not knowing one ecstasy from another, I say, after I have mentioned these things, what can be added more? What can be said to represent the misery of these times more lively to the reader, or to give him a more perfect idea of a complicated distress? I must acknowledge that this time was terrible, that I was sometimes at the end of all my resolutions, and that I had not the courage that I had at the beginning. As the extremity brought other people abroad, it drove me home, and except having made my voyage down to Blackwall and Greenwich, as I have related, which was an excursion, I kept afterwards very much within doors, as I had for about a fortnight before. I have said already that I repented several times that I had ventured to stay in town and had not gone away with my brother and his family, but it was too late for that now. And after I had retreated and stayed within doors a good while before my impatience led me abroad, then they called me, as I have said, to an ugly and dangerous office which brought me out again. But as that was expired while the height of the distemper lasted, I retired again and continued close 10 or 12 days more, during which many dismal spectacles represented themselves in my view out of my own windows and in our own street, as that particularly from Harrow Alley, of the poor outrageous creature which danced and sung in his agony, and many others there were. Scarce a day or night passed over, but some dismal thing or other happened at the end of that Harrow Alley, which was a place full of poor people, most of them belonging to the butchers, or to employments depending upon the butchery. Sometimes heaps and throngs of people would burst out of the alley, most of them women, making a dreadful clamour, mixed or compounded of screeches, cryings, and calling one another, that we could not conceive what to make of it. Almost all the dead part of the night, the dead cart stood at the end of that alley, for if it went in it could not well turn again, and could go in but a little way. There, I say, it stood to receive dead bodies, and as the churchyard was but a little way off, if it went away full, it would soon be back again. It is impossible to describe the most horrible cries and noise the poor people would make at their bringing the dead bodies of their children and friends out of the cart, and by the number one would have thought there had been none left behind, or that there were people enough for a small city living in those places. Several times they cried murder, sometimes fire, but it was easy to perceive it was all distraction, and the complaints of distressed and distempered people. I believe it was everywhere thus at that time, for the plague raged for 6 or 7 weeks beyond all that I have expressed, and came even to such a height that, in the extremity, they began to break into that excellent order of which I have spoken so much in behalf of the magistrates, namely that no dead bodies were seen in the streets or burials in the daytime, for there was a necessity in this extremity to bear with its being otherwise for a little while. One thing I cannot omit here, and indeed I thought it was extraordinary, at least it seemed a remarkable hand of divine justice, viz., that all the predictors, astrologers, fortune-tellers, and what they called cunning men, conjurers and the like, calculators of nativities and dreamers of dreams and such people, were gone and vanished. Not one of them was to be found. I am verily persuaded that a great number of them fell in the heat of the calamity, having ventured to stay upon the prospect of getting great estates. And indeed their gain was but too great for a time, through the madness and folly of the people. But now they were silent. Many of them went to their long home, not able to foretell their own fate or to calculate their own nativities. Some have been critical enough to say that every one of them died. I dare not affirm that, but this I must own, that I never heard of one of them that ever appeared after the calamity was over. But to return to my particular observations during this dreadful part of the visitation, I am now come, as I have said, to the month of September, which was the most dreadful of its kind, I believe, that ever London saw. For by all the accounts which I have seen of the preceding visitations which have been in London, nothing has been like it, the number in the weekly bill amounting to almost 40,000, from the 22nd of August to the 26th of September, being but 5 weeks. The particulars of the bills are as follows, viz., from August the 22nd to the 29th, 7,496. From the 29th to the 5th of September, 8,252. From September the 5th to the 12th, 7,690. From the 12th to the 19th, 8,297. From the 19th to the 26th, 6,460. A total of 38,195. This was a prodigious number of itself, but if I should add the reasons which I have to believe that this account was deficient, and how deficient it was, you would with me make no scruple to believe that there died above 10,000 a week, for all those weeks, one week with another, and a proportion for several weeks both before and after. The confusion among the people, especially within the city at that time, was inexpressible. The terror was so great at last that the courage of the people appointed to carry away the dead began to fail them. Nay, several of them died, although they had the distemper before and were recovered, and some of them dropped down when they had been carrying the bodies even at the pit side and just ready to throw them in. And this confusion was greater in the city because they had flattered themselves with hopes of escaping and thought the bitterness of death was past. One cart, they told us, going up Shoreditch was forsaken of the drivers, or being left to one man to drive, he died in the street. And the horses going on overthrew the cart and left the bodies, some thrown out here, some there, in a dismal manner. Another cart was, it seems, found in the great pit in Finsbury Fields, the driver being dead, or having been gone and abandoned it, and the horses running too near it, the cart fell in and drew the horses in also. It was suggested that the driver was thrown in with it, and that the cart fell upon him, by reason his whip was seen to be in the pit among the bodies, but that, I suppose, could not be certain. In our parish of Aldgate, the dead carts were several times, as I have heard, found standing at the churchyard gate full of dead bodies, but neither bellman or driver or anyone else with it. Neither in these or many other cases did they know what bodies they had in their cart, for sometimes they were let down with ropes out of balconies and out of windows, and sometimes the bearers brought them to the cart, sometimes other people, nor, as the men themselves said, did they trouble themselves to keep any account of the numbers. The vigilance of the magistrates was now put to the utmost trial, and it must be confessed can never be enough acknowledged on this occasion also, whatever expense or trouble they were at, two things were never neglected in the city or suburbs either. 1. Provisions were always to be had in full plenty, and the price was not much raised neither, hardly worth speaking. 2. No dead bodies lay unburied or uncovered, and if one walked from one end of the city to another, no funeral or sign of it was to be seen in the daytime, except a little, as I have said above, in the first 3 weeks in September. This last article, perhaps, will hardly be believed when some accounts which others have published since that shall be seen, wherein they say that the dead lay unburied, which I am assured was utterly false. At least if it had been anywhere so, it must have been in houses where the living were gone from the dead, having found means, as I have observed, to escape, and where no notice was given to the officers. All which amounts to nothing at all in the case in hand, for this I am positive in, having myself been employed a little in the direction of that part in the parish in which I lived, and where as great a desolation was made in proportion to the number of inhabitants as was anywhere. I say, I am sure that there were no dead bodies remained unburied, that is to say, none that the proper officers knew of, none for want of people to carry them off and buriers to put them into the ground and cover them. And this is sufficient to the argument. For what might lie in houses and holes, as in Moses and Harrow Alley, is nothing, for it is most certain they were buried as soon as they were found. As to the first article, namely of provisions and scarcity or dearness, though I have mentioned it before and shall speak of it again, yet I must observe here. 1. The price of bread in particular was not much raised. From the beginning of the year, viz. In the first week in March, the penny wheaten loaf was 10 ounces and a half, and in the height of the contagion it was to be had at 9 ounces and a half, and never dearer, no, not all that season. And about the beginning of November it was sold 10 ounces and a half again, the like of which, I believe, was never heard of in any city under so dreadful a visitation before. 2. Neither was there, which I wondered much at, any want of bakers or ovens kept open to supply the people with the bread. But this was indeed alleged by some families, viz. That their maidservants going to the bakehouses with their dough to be baked, which was then the custom, sometimes came back with a sickness, that is to say, the plague, upon them. In all this dreadful visitation there were, as I have said before, but 2 pest houses made of use, viz. One in the fields beyond Old Street, and one in Westminster. Neither was there any compulsion used in carrying people thither. Indeed, there was no need of compulsion in the case, for there were thousands of poor distressed people who, having no help or conveniences or supplies but of charity, would have been very glad to have been carried thither and been taken care of, which indeed was the only thing that I think was wanting in the whole public management of the city, seeing nobody was here allowed to be brought to the pest house but where money was given, or security for money, either at their introducing or upon their being cured and sent out. For very many were sent out again whole, and very good physicians were appointed to those places, so that many people did very well there, of which I shall make mention again. The principal sort of people sent thither were, as I have said, servants who got the distemper by going of errands to fetch necessaries to the families where they lived, and who in that case, if they came home sick, were removed to preserve the rest of the house. And they were so well looked after there, in all the time of the visitation, that there was but 156 buried, in all at the London pest house, and 159 at that of Westminster. By having more pest houses, I am far from meaning of forcing all people into such places. Had the shutting up of houses been omitted, and the sick hurried out of their dwellings to pest houses, as some proposed, it seems, at that time as well since, it would certainly have been much worse than it was. The very removing of the sick would have been a spreading of the infection, and the rather because that removing could not effectually clear the house where the sick person was of the distemper, and the rest of the family, being then left at liberty, would certainly spread it among others. The methods also in private families, which would have been universally used to have concealed the distemper and to have concealed the persons being sick, would have been such that the distemper would sometimes have seized a whole family before any visitors or examiners could have known of it. On the other hand, the prodigious numbers which would have been sick at a time would have exceeded all the capacity of public pest houses to receive them, or of public officers to discover and remove them. This was well considered in those days, and I have heard them talk of it often. The magistrates had enough to do to bring people to submit to having their houses shut up, and many ways they, editors note the people, deceived the watchmen and got out, as I have observed. But that difficulty made it apparent that they, editors note, the magistrates, would have found it impracticable to have gone the other way to work, for they could never have forced the sick people out of their beds and out of their dwellings. It must not have been my Lord Mayor's officers, but an army of officers that must have attempted it, and the people, on the other hand, would have been enraged and desperate, and would have killed those that should have offered to have meddled with them or with their children and relations, whatever had befallen them for it, so that they would have made the people, who, as it was, were in the most terrible distraction imaginable, I say, they would have made them stark mad, whereas the magistrates found it proper on several occasions to treat them with lenity and compassion, and not with violence and terror such as dragging the sick out of their houses or obliging them to remove themselves would have been. This leads me again to mention the time when the plague first began, that is to say, when it became certain that it would spread over the whole town, when, as I have said, the better sort of people first took the alarm and began to hurry themselves out of the town. It was true, as I observed in its place, that the throng was so great, and the coaches, horses, wagons, and carts were so many, driving and dragging the people away, that it looked as if all the city was running away. And had any regulations been published that had been terrifying at that time, especially such as would pretend to dispose of the people otherwise than they would dispose of themselves, it would have put both the city and suburbs into the utmost confusion. But the magistrates wisely caused the people to be encouraged, made very good bylaws for the regulating the citizens, keeping good order in the streets, and making everything as eligible as possible to all sorts of people. In the first place, the Lord Mayor and the sheriffs, the Court of Aldermen, and a certain number of the Common Council men or their deputies came to a resolution and published it, viz., that they would not quit the city themselves, but that they would always be at hand for the preserving good order in every place and for doing justice on all occasions, as also for the distributing the public charity to the poor, and, in a word, for for the doing the duty and discharging the trust reposed in them by the citizens to the utmost of their power. In pursuance of these orders, the Lord Mayor, sheriffs, etc., held councils every day, more or less, for making such dispositions as they found needful for preserving the civil peace. And though they used the people with all possible gentleness and clemency, yet all manner of presumptuous rogues, such as thieves, housebreakers, plunderers of the dead or of the sick, were duly punished, and several declarations were continually published by the Lord Mayor and Court of Aldermen against such. Also, all constables and churchwardens were enjoined to stay in the city upon several penalties, or to depute such able and sufficient housekeepers, editor's note, replacements, as the deputy aldermen or common councilmen of the precinct should approve, and for whom they should give security, and also security in case of mortality, that they would forthwith constitute other constables in their stead. These things re-established the minds of the people very much, especially in the first of their fright, when they talked of making so universal a flight that the city would have been in danger of being entirely deserted of its inhabitants, except the poor, and the country of being plundered and laid waste by the multitude. Nor were the magistrates deficient in performing their part as boldly as they promised it, for my Lord Mayor and the sheriffs were continually in the streets and at places of the greatest danger, and though they did not care for having too great a resort of people crowding about them, yet in emergent cases they never denied the people access to them, and heard with patience all their grievances and complaints. My Lord Mayor had a low gallery built on purpose in his hall, where he stood a little removed from the crowd when any complaint came to be heard, that he might appear with as much safety as possible. Likewise, the proper officers, called my Lord Mayor's officers, constantly attended in their turns, as they were in waiting, and if any of them were sick or infected, as some of them were, others were instantly employed to fill up and officiate in their places till it was known whether the other should live or die. In like manner, the sheriffs and aldermen did in their several stations and wards where they were placed by office, and the sheriff's officers or sergeants were appointed to receive orders from the respective aldermen in their turn, so that justice was executed in all cases without interruption. In the next place, it was one of their particular cares to see the orders for the freedom of the markets observed, and in this part either the Lord Mayor or one or both of the sheriffs were every market day on horseback to see their orders executed, and to see that the country people had all possible encouragement and freedom in their coming to the markets and going back again, and that no nuisances or frightful objects should be seen in the streets to terrify them or make them unwilling to come. Also, the bakers were taken under particular order, and the master of the bakers' company was, with his court of assistants, directed to see the order of my Lord Mayor for their regulation put in execution, and the due assize of bread, which was weekly appointed by my Lord Mayor, observed. And all the bakers were obliged to keep their oven going constantly, on pain of losing the privileges of a freeman of the city of London. By this means bread was always to be had in plenty, and as cheap as usual, as I said above. And provisions were never wanting in the markets, even to such a degree that I often wondered at it, and reproached myself with being so timorous and cautious in stirring abroad, when the country people came freely and boldly to market, as if there had been no manner of infection in the city, or danger of catching it. And there we'll stop for today, page 197. Oh, look at this. It's falling to pieces, and who can blame it? Yesterday's episode is there. Tomorrow's when it goes up will be there. If you want to leave a tip, there's a jar below. Thank you very much, so much to everyone who has. It's completely voluntary. That's how tips work. I hope you're all doing tremendously. Bye-bye.